I'm in the town of Guanica. This is in the southern coast of Puerto Rico. And I'm looking towards the bay. Let me show you. This is the bay that United States troops came through when they invaded Puerto Rico in 1898. Now, at the time, General Nelson Miles said the reason to occupy Puerto Rico when it was still a colony of Spain was to bring, quote, a banner of freedom. But it has been 120 years, and Puerto Rico is still a possession of the U.S. And as such, Puerto Ricans don't get much of a say in what happens in the United States. For example, Puerto Ricans living in Puerto Rico can't vote for president, so they didn't get a say in the election of Joe Biden. But then again, there are aspects about their own land and money that Puerto Ricans don't get much of a say in either. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of that. Let's start in Vieques. It was the early 1940s, and the U.S. Navy had set its eyes on the Puerto Rican island of Vieques. They decided they wanted to set a military base there, so they bought 2/3 of the island and forced out the people who were living there.
Mi mamá me explicaba cómo fue que llegó la Marina a Vieques, que los abusos cometieron, que los bulldozers le tumbaban las casas a ellos.
Ismael Guadalupe's aunt, Severina Guadalupe, told an Orlando newspaper that she was 13 years old when two men showed up at her family's house and gave them 24 hours to leave. She says the next day she saw a bulldozer destroy their wooden house. She was in her 70s at the time of that interview, but the reporter writes that she teared up as she said, quote, "It was just a cruel, cruel thing." But even after those expropriations, the Navy wasn't done taking up land. In the early 60s, U.S. government officials discussed a secret plan to have the Navy take over the entire island of Vieques. Part of the plan was to forcibly remove the entire Vieques population of more than 8,000 and even dig up the bodies from the cemeteries, because once people were forced out of Vieques, they would not be allowed back in to visit their loved ones' graves. That plan was eventually abandoned, and what followed were decades of Viequenses coexisting with U.S. Navy bombing.
Los aviones volaban sobre todo esto.
Ismael Guadalupe dedicated most of his life to the fight to kick the Navy out of Vieques.
Toda mi vida, desde que yo era estudiante, que era hasta apenas un pibe, yo me pasaba tirándole piedra a los soldados, a defender las calles, porque ellos le faltaban el respeto aquí a las mujeres.
There were two killings during the Navy's time on Vieques that stick out in the minds of Viequenses. And to understand the first one, you have to know what the nights were like in Vieques in the 50s. Viequenses tell stories of soldiers flooding the streets looking for sex and alcohol. One of those nights, a fight broke out at a local bar, and an elderly barkeeper was killed. Witnesses at the time said the Marines were trying to get to a woman at the local bar, and the barkeeper, who went by the name of Mapepe, stood in the way. 2 Marines were charged with beating him to death, but were eventually found not guilty. That case and its outcome reinforced the feeling that Viequenses had that the military and its soldiers operated with impunity in Vieques. In the following decades, Vieques residents became organized and more emboldened to stand up to the Navy.
Yo estuve varias veces preso por desobediencia civil. El desafío era pararnos frente a los barcos para que no dispararan.
Porque estaban interfiriendo con las prácticas militares. Imagínate, el ejército más poderoso del mundo.
Norma Torres is Ismael's wife.
A él lo enjuiciaron a 6 meses de prisión.
She keeps the newspaper clippings of her husband's multiple arrests and of the town welcoming him home when he was released.
El pueblo se desbordó. Bienvenido a casa, Ismael.
Ismael was arrested for the first time in 1979.
Me encuentro más combativo que el 2 de octubre, hasta que nosotros en Vieques logremos sacar la Marina, hasta sacarlo y rescatar el último pulgada de tierra que tiene la Marina controlada en nuestro pueblo de Vieques.
The fight of Viequenses against the U.S. Navy became known as that of David versus Goliath. And it went on for a couple more decades, and then the death of Norma's cousin.
Lanzaron la bomba donde no la tenían que lanzar y cayó prácticamente encima de él.
David Sanes was working as a security guard for the Navy when he was killed in a bombing accident in 1999.
Muchacho bien bueno, bien humilde, bien sencillo. Todo el mundo lo quería mucho.
This was the second killing that became a turning point for the people of Vieques. David's death fueled the protests to drive out the Navy. And in 2001, the people of Vieques voted overwhelmingly for the Navy to stop the bombing and leave the island immediately. But the vote was non-binding, and the Navy responded by saying that the outcome of the referendum organized by the governor would have no impact on the Navy or their focus. The Navy stayed in Vieques 2 more years.
Es una caricatura que el muchacho le hizo y se lo envió hace poco. Y yo, ay Dios mío, estos muchachos son la changa.
More than 17 years after the Navy left, Viequenses say they're still suffering the consequences. A survey by the Puerto Rico Health Department found that the cancer rate in Vieques is 27% higher than in the main island.
Yo mismo estoy contaminado. Yo mismo tengo mercurio en el cuerpo. Yo espero que ya se me haya ido. Me afectó mi corazón, me afectó los riñones.
But the U.S. government says there's no proof that there's a link between the Navy's military activity and the health issues of the Vieques population.
Entonces los abusos están grandes. Son grandes y grandes y grandes y grandes.
The people of Vieques did everything they could. They marched, they protested, they voted. But in the end, the U.S. Navy stayed on their land for more than 60 years in the name of national security.
Oye, esta es nuestra casa.
So I told you I was going to give you a couple of examples of Puerto Ricans not having much of a say over their own land and money. For that second part, we're going to go to the town of Naranjito.
Vamos a ver si nos pegamos, Carlito.
Pedro Cruz was a public school teacher for 35 years. Now that he's retired, he has to sell lottery tickets because he says his pension is not enough to cover his expenses.
Yo creo que mi situación no es particular, la padecen la inmensa mayoría de los pensionados del gobierno de Puerto Rico. Y están por ahí en la precariedad. Te lo digo honestamente que están en la precariedad.
The thing is that the pension he's getting now could be cut even lower. And that decision is in the hands of people who were not elected by Puerto Ricans. I'm talking about the Financial Oversight and Management Board. In Puerto Rico, they're known as La Junta. And I've talked about them in previous videos because they hold so much power over the island's finances. A Puerto Rican senator confronted a member of Congress about the board in a hearing in 2018.
When you do the budget of the United States, if you had an oversight board coming from Russia or somewhere else or whatever it is, giving you and telling you, we will tell you what your budget is. I think that's shameful for the United States. What happened to government of the people and by the people?
Now I want to tell you how La Junta came about, but it gets a little complicated, so bear with me for the next minute. Puerto Rico was $72 billion in debt that it could not pay back, and Wall Street was demanding payment. See, what happens with Puerto Rico's debt is that a lot of it is owed to what's commonly known as vulture funds. Those are hedge funds that knew Puerto Rico was in financial trouble when they bought portions of the debt. But that's what made it so attractive, because the bonds were cheap. They bought them for 50, sometimes 25 cents on the dollar. But then they can sue Puerto Rico in order to be paid full face value plus interest. So in some cases, they're demanding to be paid twice or 3 times what they paid from an island that's in deep financial trouble. And this is where Puerto Rico's status comes in. Because it's a territory, it cannot file for bankruptcy like a state would, so it can't protect itself.
The people of Puerto Rico need to know that they're not forgotten, that they're part of the American family.
So in 2016, President Barack Obama signed the law that created La Junta. The law gave Puerto Rico some bankruptcy protections in exchange for a board that would closely oversee the island's finances and order cuts to essential services for Puerto Ricans.
Ni un solo recorte a las pensiones.
Lo que es contradictorio es que unas personas que le han dado lo mejor de sí durante tantos años, la educación, y el gobierno en última instancia lo que hace es que muchas veces olvida hacerle verdadera justicia a estos trabajadores de la educación como es el maestro.
I'll end this video by taking you to where it all started in 1898. If you wonder why the U.S. has the power to do what it did in Vieques or to cut people's pensions in Puerto Rico, it was written in the Constitution. It says that Congress has the absolute power over the territory or other property of the United States, and Puerto Rico falls under that category. As always, I want to know what you think. Tell me in the comments, and I'll see you soon.